The first question Laura and I will discuss is, Laura, what did you believe when you were younger that you no longer believe now, and why do you no longer believe it?
There's like such a long list of things I could put there about things I believed. I mean, I believed that a 13-year-old Indian boy was God. That's what I believed when I was a teenager. I had a guru that I followed. I dropped out of my life and followed a guru when I was 15 years old. So that's what I believed then. Basically that someone else would have the answers, and that the best way to go through life, or maybe the safest way, was to have someone dictate to me what I should do and how I should live. Because I think I was so opaque to myself. I just had no idea who I was. I hadn't dealt with any of the trauma from my early life. And I was just looking for basically a safe harbor that could get me out of my family. And that's what that choice was about as a teenager. Now I say that in hindsight. At the time I thought, oh, I was in a cult. But I don't look at it that way. I look at it as a safe harbor that sheltered me for, I think 4 years at that time. I think I believed, well, I didn't believe that I was going to have a life. I didn't believe that I would ever have love. I didn't believe I was capable of being like other people. I felt, in that early time in my life, I felt really damaged and separate and isolated from everybody. And I was numb, so I've come to life, over the course of all the decades. Um,
I can certainly relate to that. I was, as a teenager, I was actually closer friends with my teachers than most of my peers. And my parents' marriage was troubled, had been like for as long as I can remember. Even from young childhood, I thought, why are these people still married to each other? I never saw them being affectionate or
mhm.
seeming to get along very well. Um, and so, yeah, I was desperate for affection and approval from others. I just happened to get it from teachers and other adults by being the overachiever, straight A student, teacher's pet. Um, and so, that was great as long as I was achieving and getting the college scholarship and graduating summa cum laude, and then going on to a seminary, becoming a pastor. But when my career as a pastor kind of basically crashed and burned because I decided that Christian theology was too exclusive and confining for me. Um, I believe God loves everyone, no exceptions, including
Mhm.
atheists and whatever your beliefs may be, whether or not you believe there is a God, or whatever name or descriptor
Yeah.
you use for that God. Um, and I was also just frankly appalled by the behavior of so many Christians who were seeming to do the opposite of everything Jesus taught and modeled in terms of loving everyone and helping the least of these. So I gave up my career as a pastor, and my big changing belief, not only with theologically wise, but just about myself, was that I have to be true to who I am, and I have to um, do the work that I'm called to do, whether other people understand or agree with it or not, and that I don't need others' approval to feel good about myself and know that I'm a good person, basically. And
I mean,
that's what led me to my work, similar to your
mhm.
story, is that I wanted to help other people who had been harmed by this toxic version of religion and all the teachings about original sin and women being submissive to men, and anti-LGBTQ hate, anti-immigrant stuff, just racism, the works. I had to speak out about all of that, and doing that, unfortunately, was not popular with some church members who didn't want to hear that Jesus didn't share their bigoted views. So now I'm a spiritual coach, a mental and spiritual health writer, support group leader, and peer coach. And so that's my way of creating those safe, intentional communities, as you do for writers. So you want to share more about your retreats and your community here on Substack?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, the reason I got motivated to come on Substack really had to do with the political change, what's happening in the U.S. And I felt like I wanted to do more than, just go outside and hold a picket sign or a sign, which I do. And I really thought about what of my skills, what can I bring to the table? What's like my little teaspoon of what I have to offer to the resistance? What do I have to do? What can I offer that will help people at this time when there's just so much fear, danger, uncertainty? Nobody knows what's going to happen next. And I realize that what people need now, what I need now, is community. That being really connected in community, both locally where I live, but also online and writing communities, and having the opportunity to really deeply express what's in my heart, what's on my mind. Whether it's a prayer or a rant, or a story. Um, that those are really important ways for people to feel connected and to be fed. And so I just decided I wanted to take the skills I had in facilitating groups, in designing writing prompts, in writing and telling the truth from a very deep place, and to offer those, as a way to create an online, basically a harbor, a sanctuary, an online sanctuary where people could express, hear, read the truth. Whatever their truth is. I don't have an agenda of what people should say, but to really, like, what's the story under the story? Like, if you step out from under the anxiety or the news cycle or the things that keep us spinning, what's really going on in the deepest place, and what can we each do to find our equilibrium right now? So, I feel like what I'm offering is hopefully will help some people, even if it's just like a little weekly dose of something where they could go, ah, yes, I remember. I don't have to keep spinning in this same way. So that's
Yes,
what motivated me. um,
exactly. And
yeah,
as I said, similar here. My big offering currently is a 6 week Zoom spiritual support for weary souls group, and the next
a lot of
group
weary souls
starts on
right
May
now.
4th.
Yeah.
And it'll be on Sunday mornings. And if anybody wants to learn more about it, you can go to bit.ly/weary souls, all lowercase. But anyway, I after I did the first group, participants, the number one takeaway for people was, oh my God, I didn't realize how much I needed to
Yeah.
just have a safe space to talk about all this stuff, not just the political turmoil, but the religion being intertwined with it in very twisted, sick ways, and the harm being done, even if we ourselves didn't feel, imminently in danger. We had LGBTQ friends, we had immigrant friends, we just are basic decent human beings who don't like to see anyone being beat up or threatened or intimidated. And but for many, their former source of spiritual support had been a faith community that had become toxic,
Mhm.
and they felt it necessary to leave for whatever reason, or they had never been part of a faith community, because they didn't feel welcome, for one, or that just wasn't their belief system or their families. But we're all spiritual people. Spiritual experiences can happen anywhere to anyone. Bruce Springsteen concerts are one of my most spiritual experiences, as is time in nature for sure.
Mhm.
And so, the people loved this group so much. Long story short, after 6 weeks, when it was due to end, they said, "Please, can we keep meeting? We'll pay another fee so we can keep this going." And so we have. We switched from every week to monthly, and then I'm starting the same kind of group again on Sunday mornings on May 4th for 6 weeks. But yeah, it's just that desperate need for community and feeling like we can talk about these deeper issues. Sometimes it's a rant, sometimes it's just, I feel so powerless, I feel so hopeless, I feel so scared about the future. But you never know these days. We're so polarized. Who is it safe to voice this to? And so I created a community that I limited to 12 people, and it's live only, nothing's recorded. And I made it very clear in all the guidelines that, spirituality can include tarot cards, it can include moon cycles, it can include anything and
Yeah.
everything, because everything is spiritual, basically. So, yeah, it sounds like you and I have very similar desires and recognition of the need, both in ourselves and in the wider society to create that kind of safe environment to go deeper and really talk about these things.
I think, you were saying about what other things have changed for me. I think I've always been a real manifester. Like I've published 7 books. I've been a self-employed, solopreneur, I guess you call it, for
Hmm.
35 years. I'm always generating something. And, at this point in my life, I'm just not so interested in that. It's like naturally comes out of me, but I find, I have this little sign on the wall in my office. It just says, I am enough, I do enough, I have enough. And
Love
that's my mantra right now is like I don't really my internal life and my life in my community and whatever I could do is important to me, but I feel like I need more spaciousness. I think that's the biggest change for me is that I just crave open time and space. That's my experience of aging. Um, And I was leading a trip last summer in Bali, and the last day, like the very last thing we did, I had everybody standing in a circle, and we were passing around like a talking stick kind of thing. And I just said, wait till it comes to you and say whatever it is that you want to be your takeaway from this, whatever it was, like a 18-day trip, this experience we've just had. And when it came, people said all kinds of different things, some of which I maybe would have predicted from what they had written over the course of a couple of weeks. But when it came to me, I took this thing in my hand and I just said, I want to be nobody. And that sentence came out of some really deep place in me. I had no idea I was going to say it. It just bubbled up. And it's been part of my meditation ever since. I want to be nobody. Like that, the ego identity that I've carried my whole life, it's not that interesting to me anymore. It's like a coat I could put on, but I often want to just take it off. So I feel like that's a big change and it feels like a relief. Um,
And maybe for those who don't already know your story, you had kind of a unique journey in that your first book became a runaway bestseller, and you did kind of suddenly become famous for something you didn't necessarily want to be famous for. So, you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. When I was in my late 20s, I remembered having been sexually abused as a child by my grandfather, and I had really blocked it out. And I mean, to talk about a long story short, I ended up collaborating with my friend and colleague, Ellen Bass, and we wrote this book, The Courage to Heal. And it was the first book that um, told people how to heal from sexual trauma. It just wasn't talked about very much, and when it was talked about, the message was basically your life is ruined. You are now a tragedy. And
Mhm.
our book was the first book that really had a map of this is how you heal from this kind of trauma. And it was just one of those kind of moments of being in the right place at the right time and really hitting the zeitgeist of that moment. And the book just took off, and like 6 months later, it was like it sold 1.5 million copies, and I was only 31 years old when it came out. Like now, that's how old my son is 32. So, I was really young, and I wasn't really prepared for that kind of notoriety, especially for one of the worst things that had ever happened to me. And I ended up, on the road giving lectures and speaking to huge audiences of, auditoriums full of women and signing books and just having this kind of incredible experience, but also a challenging experience because what was I talking about? I was talking about my trauma all the time. And what were people talking to me about? Their trauma. I would go like even or one time here in Santa Cruz, California, where I live, I went to the movies and there was a woman outside the stall in the bathroom telling me her sexual abuse story. And I felt like I could not get away from it. And after, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life with that being what I was known for. And so I basically walked away from, all those opportunities. And I had written 4 books on this subject. And I just thought, I want to now live the life I have earned through my healing process. I don't want to spend the rest of my life talking about it. And, so for me, that trauma is now I like to describe it kind of like it's part of the fabric of what shaped me. but it's not how I identify anymore. Like if I was 28 and you said, "Who are you?" I would have said, "I'm an incest survivor." And that would have been really all I could see because it was just so consuming, the healing process. And now I don't even think it wouldn't be on the list. It's part of me, but I would say, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a workshop leader, I'm an author, I'm a mahjong player, I'm a hiker, I'm a dog lover. There's just a lot of other ways that I would identify myself, and that feels, like really incredible progress. Um, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing is sometimes we go through things and we need to identify with them very strongly for a period of time. But for me, that period of time ended because I really had done the work. And it was like, okay, now what kind of life do I want to have? Like, who do I want to be? And I don't think we ever completely get over the things that have hurt us or anything that shaped us. I mean, it just becomes part of us. But you learn to live with it and just move forward.
Absolutely. I actually began my Changing Life Substack about 3 years ago, after I had recovered from perhaps the most severe depression of my life, where I literally spent an entire year with suicidal ideations and just being utterly miserable. And that was shortly after my career as a pastor had crashed
Mhm.
and burned, and I realized how much my sense of self worth was tied to my um, professional identity and everybody praising my, everything I did, my sermons, my ministering to, families when a loved one died, leading the funeral, whatever, and I had to, take a step back and say, okay, who am I, Wendi, as a person, not Wendi as a pastor, not Wendi as the, summa cum laude graduate, whatever, and at first, an important part of my healing was writing and sharing that writing publicly on my Substack, because my mission was to reduce the stigma associated with mental health, and especially talking about suicidal ideations. And I deliberately avoided all talk of religion or spirituality because, I didn't want to alienate anyone, didn't want to offend them. Well, that, has evolved now to, no, this is exactly what,
Mhm.
what my primary mission is. There's plenty of people in the mental health field, and we all have our own stories and our unique ways of helping people. Um, but at the same time, there are not very many, women who are former pastors who have made that journey from, their beliefs evolving, they're leaving a faith community in search of, okay, what do I believe? I know what I'm against, but what am I for? And that's kind of, where I'm at now, and why I'm leading these groups is to help other people either figure out what they're for, or cope with, family members and former church members that they, are used to be very close to, but have become estranged because of all this political stuff and it's intermingling with religion, and, disagreeing. Some family members think they're going to go to hell now, and, this, that, and the other thing. But, getting through that to, okay, it's okay for me to live my life and believe what I believe, even if people I love think it's not okay and tell me it's not okay.
Yeah, I think getting past wanting to create something or be someone that people will like is just such a time of freedom. When you get to the point of like, I'm going to be who I am. I mean, the first thing I learned on Substack, interestingly, that I really absorbed was be yourself. So like if I want to for instance, if I want to post about politics, I want to post about how I feel about what's going on, I'm going to do it. I'm
Hmm.
not going to hold back because someone might think differently. It's like I'm going to present who I am fully, and people will either gravitate to that or they won't. Whether as a colleague or a student or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm not, my goal is not to impose my beliefs. My goal is to help people get to their own truth and express it, in language, in words.
Exactly.
The other thing I really love is, in terms of community, in terms of writing, I feel like the circuit is that you write something true, and then I feel like it needs to be heard. So, when I teach, reading out loud is always an essential part of the process. Like the writing is the inhalation, reading out loud is the exhalation. And when it's witnessed by someone else who is not judging it or evaluating or critiquing it, but is just witnessing and receiving it. That is such an incredibly healing thing, when someone for the first time writes about X or Y or really tells the truth about what's going on. And I find for me that when I'm a student in a writing group, and I always make sure I'm a student as well as a teacher, I think it's important to do that because then I'm in touch with how vulnerable I'm asking people
Hmm.
to be. Um, there's sometimes I could express something or write about something in a writing group that I wouldn't tell my wife, or I'm not ready to tell my wife or the people closest to me, because you're in a circle with people who are not directly involved in your life. And that
Yes.
gives so much freedom to be able to try something out or voice it for the first time or
That's
express
what
it.
struck me the most in my Zoom group was the number of participants who said, "I can't believe I just shared this. I
Right,
haven't even told my partner or my best
right,
friend or
right.
my parent or my child who really closest friends and relatives, and here I am sharing it with people I don't know at all. But you're right. It is very freeing, and just that witnessing and that unconditional acceptance, and other people, whether they agree or disagree with you, they still honor your experience and your willingness to talk about it, and don't come back and tell you why you're wrong or why their belief or their way of doing it is better and you should be more like them. My last guest, actually, we had a part of our conversation, this was Nancy Norbeck, was about the danger of spiritual gurus, especially, but any, expert who tells other people, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to change your beliefs from to in order to heal, in order to be a good person, right with God, whatever. And it's not healthy for any of us to look outside of ourselves for someone else to either fix our life or make us feel lovable, or whatever it might be. We have to do that inner work and find what works for us, and it may be not what works for even the majority of people or for that particular teacher. One of the things about writing that I love is that all these different famous writers that teach or write books about how to write, they sometimes give contradictory advice, and it just goes to show that what works for one person
Right,
is
absolutely.
not
Yeah,
necessarily right for somebody else, and that's okay.
yeah, yeah. I'm next month. I'm teaching a retreat called "Flourishing as We Age," and it's for women getting older and dealing with changes, grief, gratitude, all kinds of things. And I saw this morning I was like pulling quotes to use in my curriculum, and I pulled one out that I thought would be fun to share here, and it's in the third semester of my life, I can't pretend to be anyone other than who I am. And that's
Love
from a
that.
book called Fresh Hell. And that really strikes me. Like I feel like that's the freedom of getting older. Hopefully, is that this is who I am. This is, and I spent so much of my life trying to like squeeze myself into little knots to be who I thought other people wanted or needed me to be. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm also, I'm at a free point in my life. I was my mother's caregiver, until she died, but she died 11 years ago. My three children are launched independent, and I'm in a position where I really have the freedom and the privilege to live the life I want to. Um, and it's interesting to be in that position because for many decades my role was to take care of other people. When you have a family, you're very engrossed in taking care of others' needs.
Yeah, and although I don't have children and have not been a primary caregiver for a parent, it was similar for me as a pastor, and I think for women in our
Mhm.
society as a whole, there's that expectation that your needs come last, and it's admirable to always put other people's needs first, and to be serving and volunteering and doing whatever anybody else needs, and not you know thinking about, okay, what do I need, how do I get support from others, and not always be the one giving the support. um, and yeah, like you said, it's just so liberating to reach that point. That was another big thing for me when I was no longer a pastor. I didn't have to worry about, is something that I say publicly or even that I post on my Facebook page or, something going to offend members and create conflict in the congregation or, whatever it might be. And as soon as I was no longer a pastor, one of the first articles I wrote as a freelancer for an independent Texas publication was why Christians must denounce Christian nationalism. And it was basically
Right, that is
not
not a
quite an
neutral
angry rant,
subject.
but I interviewed other pastors and Christians about, the danger of this ideology and how harmful it was to try to force your beliefs on other people, and how wrong it was to, justify this hate and this violence and all of the rest. And that article got like 30,000 views. The editor of the publication was like, "Thank you so much. This is one of the best responses we've ever gotten." And I went on to write several more articles, you know, critical of the Texas Republican Party and linking to their official platform and quoting from it and so forth. And yeah, I never could have done that when I was a
Right.
pastor. At least not that, blatantly, critically, here it is, blunt. This is what I believe. This is why. This is my story of my transgender friend who was literally jumped in the middle of the Kroger grocery store in broad daylight with slurs yelled at her and got beat up and would have been hurt worse if another shopper hadn't pulled her attacker off of her, and then had to deal with the police trying to blame her. Did you come on to this guy? What did you do that made this, nice, white, respectable guy attack you?
Yeah,
And
that's.
I could say all of that openly and
Mhm.
just rant about how wrong it is and not care how other people responded. If I got trolled or whatever, so what? This is me. This is what I believe. If you agree, then and we become, you become part of my tribe. We're kindred spirits. We connect and have more conversations. Great. If you think I'm going to hell or I'm a terrible person leading people astray, whatever, fine, go your way, go in peace, not my problem.
Yeah, good for you. I'm glad I really respect that you are standing up and saying those things, especially for a population that is so small and tiny and is not in a position to be able to defend themselves when you're being targeted like that. Um,
Absolutely.
you were saying about from 50, the age 50. It's
Hmm.
interesting. When I was 50, I had breast cancer. And at the time, I had a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, and then an older
Mm,
son also.
wow.
But I had two, school age kids. And I just I went for an annual exam. My doctor was doing a breast exam. She felt something, and like 3 days later, I had a cancer diagnosis, and went through a year of really intense chemo and other things. And coming out of that, so that this was 18 years ago. And coming out of that, I had such an incredible feeling of like, what is matters to me in my life, and I'm always feel like since then, death is always sitting on my shoulder, and for me,
Mm,
it's a really helpful companion to have. I'm very aware of my mortality, and I am not afraid of it. I don't feel fearful about it, but it makes me always thinking, am I really doing in my life what I want to be doing? Am I showing up the way I want to show up? Whether it's in the community, for my students, in my relationship, for my children, for my grandchildren, for myself, am I, so for me, carrying that with me um, gives me a sense of immediacy, like we do not know what the future is going to be. And in some ways, I think that is helping me deal with the incredible uncertainty in the United States right now, is that I feel like I've been living with that already, in my own life as just a reality. I can't assume I have a long future ahead of me, or I can't assume anything. I just have had that visceral experience that in one moment your whole life can change, and then change again, and then change again. You were talking about estrangement. I was really very deeply estranged from my mother, because it was her father who had sexually abused me, and she and her whole side of the family. So this was many years ago. 40 years ago, where like I was outcast. I wasn't invited to the weddings, to the ceremonies, and everyone was, claimed I was making up lies.
Mm,
And like you were talking about leaving the church and that feeling of just being so isolated and lonely and feeling so cast out of a family that had felt nurturing to me at the time.
hmm
And then decades went by, and ultimately I did reconcile with my mother. I mean, not in a perfect way, but I learned from that too. You just never know what's going to happen, because if you had asked me when I was 30 if I would ever speak to my mother again, it was like, there's no way that will ever happen. And I ended up taking care of her at the very end of her life. So I actually like that. I like that sense of we don't know and we can't have the answers. And we have this day, we have today. What am I going to do with this day?
Absolutely. And that's one that I'm still wrestling with, because I was one of those people that, had that illusion of control and security, and, believed that I controlled my own destiny, if you will, and just believed things were more certain than they were ever were in reality. And then when my career ended unexpectedly, and life took a completely different direction after I recovered from the severe depression, and I became self-employed, um, everything was uncertain. In one fell swoop. The other piece of this is that my husband was my co-pastor. So in one fell
Oh,
swoop, we both lost our careers, our sole source of income, our housing, everything, and of course our faith community, and we had to move and all of that. Um, but like you said, the upside is, and I'm nowhere near settled now. We have a lot of financial uncertainty right now because my husband just turned 60. I'm in my mid 50s, and we're basically starting over when
yeah.
we never expected to. And but despite all of that, as you said, the gift is you realize, make the most of today, because there may not be a tomorrow. And also, I have stopped listening to, all the endless commentary and dire predictions about how much worse things are going to get. That may well be true, but even if it is true, me worrying about it now when I'm not in a position to prevent it necessarily just ruins the present as well as the future that's going could happen anyway. And no one really knows, as you said. That's the key point. There are just too many variables. And of course, our own mindset matters, and we can take actions that greatly influence, um, you know especially our own future, but really the world's future, by just being kind and creating these safe spaces for people to talk. But at the same time, yeah, there are always going to be factors beyond our control that we can't possibly predict or prepare for. And if we spend too much time in our heads, trying to forecast every possible bad scenario and somehow prepare for or prevent it, we just ruin our lives.
It's for me, it's a challenge. It's challenging to it's like this line. I feel like every day, every single day right now, I'm, like, how much am I taking in of what's happening? How much time am I spending in nature? How much
Yes.
time am I spending in service? How much time am I relaxing? How much time am I laughing? How
Yes.
much time am I feeding joy, in
hmm
my life? And it's really easy to just go down the rabbit hole, of dread, and that's very
Yes.
easy for me, the way I'm wired. And it's interesting because even though I've written all these books about healing, I think one of my conclusions is that we don't heal from everything. You know, you can get over a lot, but in terms of like that I lean towards worry, for instance, and that comes
Absolutely.
from maybe my trauma, maybe it comes from my ancestors and the lineage of worry that I carry. And so I could learn to deal with it, but it never is completely uprooted. And I think that's part of getting older for me. It's just like, this is the person I am. This is the personality I have. This is the way my brain is wired. And yes, I could make modifications, I could make changes. But when I was younger, I think I believed more in complete renovation of the self. And now it's like, I'm good enough the way I am. You know, this
Yes,
is
that
this
is
is
such
who
a
I
key
am, and I
shift.
have my foibles, I have my failings. It was interesting. I wrote a memoir about my relationship with my mother and how I ended up taking care of her. And in a very early draft, I shared it with a friend who's a writing teacher, was a creative writing professor for like 30 years. And she just read it. She ripped it apart. It was like
Mm,
devastating. And what she said was just like, you're making yourself into the hero and your mother into the villain. I wasn't intending to do that. And, it was, you have to have because my first book was The Courage to Heal. She said, Laura, this is the courage to reveal. Like you have to show you're failing. You have to show your weaknesses. You have to show your failings. You can't present yourself as the hero. And I had to really start from scratch all over again. And when I had readers, different sets of readers for
mhm.
that manuscript, and the first question was always, how does the mother come across? How does the daughter come across? Because I really wanted a fair, honest human portrayal of these two main characters. And I finally knew after 10 years that the book was finished because they'd say like, well, on this page, I hated you and loved your mother. And on this page, I loved your mother and hated you. And I thought, okay, the book is finished. That was how I decided that finally it was done. I finally was able to find that really honest place because, nobody wants to read your revenge story, you know,
Yes.
and it's not that people don't need to write it, yet it's absolutely fine to vent and to share your anger and your rage but in terms of what you publish and what you're sharing with people, they want a story that's going to move them, that's going to inspire them, and they don't want to see cardboard characters. They want to
Mhm.
see real human beings. And often if someone has like a really, evil antagonist in their book, I'll encourage them to find a scene that they could write of that person doing something they loved. Because most people are not just one way. They're complex. Um,
Absolutely, yes. And as you said, we're never fully healed. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, the experts that, are the like enlightened ones that are gonna, heal everyone else and teach them their wisdom. I mean, as you said with your groups, I am fully a participant in my group. I created the group that I knew I needed.
right.
And healing is an ongoing journey. One of my articles was self-love is a never-ending journey, and another one is about how our wounds become sources of healing instead of sources of shame by being honest about them and talking about them. And like you said about just being on Substack, the authenticity here of so many writers, the personal stuff we reveal, but not in a sense of, you know, I'm this poor victim or survivor, and look what these horrible people did to me. But I mean, it may start out that way, and some elements of that, as you said, are healthy and a necessary stage of the healing process. But then it gets to, okay, yes, that terrible thing happened to me, but what was my role in it? And more importantly, how do I want to get past it and live the life I want to live instead of always dwelling on poor me, my life is ruined because of those people and I'll never be happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tricky, because I've worked with, so many survivors of sexual abuse. That's not what I focus on now, but
Mm.
there's a point where it's really premature to say that to somebody,
Yes,
because anger, for many people, getting in touch with their anger is a huge deal and very difficult because they're taking on all the blame and the shame. And
yes,
so anger and rage is a really critical part of healing. And so you can't really cut that off too soon. And because
absolutely.
when you start expressing your anger, people are going to say to you, oh, just move on and forgive.
Hmm.
And, it happened a long time ago. And look, you're really okay. And none of that is helpful. But
Yes.
I remember
Same
there were
thing with
these,
depression. People do the
yeah.
same.
Hmm.
Or grief, when a loved one dies, there's all this pressure to, you know, get beyond it and get on with your life, and forgive is a big one. And again, for me with spiritual work, that's another big piece. People have this shame around, I can't forgive my abuser or whoever it may be. And I tell them, well, maybe one day you will. And if you don't, that's okay. You know, the you don't have to. Don't let anyone else put a timeline on your healing or tell you how you have to heal, in what way you have to heal, what kind of relationship you have to have if that person is still alive, if you have any relationship with them. All of that you determine. That is your right, and you know what you need to heal when and what is not helpful. I love Kate Bowler's book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, and then her
I love
follow
that
up,
it
No
says
Cure
and
for
other
Being
lies.
Human.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's great. Yeah. Yeah, I was told that a million billion times. It's just
mm-hmm.
really, really, really annoying. There was a couple women I interviewed like this. I mean, I still remember them because this is like over 40 years ago for the Courage to Heal. It was two sisters, and they had like really severe abuse in their family, very, like over the top extreme. And they were deep, deep into it. And the way they described it, they said it started to feel like a sweater that was too small, that just started to get too itchy and too uncomfortable. The identification with this is who I am, as I am a survivor. And they said they just had to take the sweater off and then just stand there raw, open, without that as an identity, and find out who they are, who they were. And I really felt very similar to that in my own experience. And it's happened for multiple things, because you live long enough, you go through a lot of different things that are really challenging. And for a time, you identify with them and maybe need to be with other people who've had that same experience. That's incredibly helpful. I mean, I felt that with cancer. I was in a cancer support group, but there was a point where I didn't need to do that anymore. I just wanted to keep living my life. And this was now part of my past, and potentially it could be part of my future again. So I think growth, that's the thing I love is I feel like I want to grow until I die. That's my goal. More than anything else, I just want to keep growing and I want to keep enjoying. And interestingly, things that have become much more important to me, like I've always loved nature. I had parents who took me camping and I was exposed to the natural world, the ocean, the mountains, hiking, camping from a really early age. So it's always been important to me, but it feels critically important now. If I don't get out, I live in Santa Cruz where there's the redwood forest, there's wooded trails, there's an ocean. It's just incredibly beautiful in many ways. And if I don't get out in nature every day, I just don't function very well. Like it has become essential to have that experience of just drinking in beauty, And I think as things heat up, as things get more twisted and dangerous and frightening, those kind of eternal realities of the natural world have become just a lifeline for me, and I think
Yes.
for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I'm one of those people too. There's a local park that I walk at, whenever possible, almost every day, but some days weather makes it impossible, in which case I watch like nature videos on your YouTube or nature documentaries. But as you said, that is the only place where I feel utterly calm and at peace, even though I can still hear traffic noise around me. But I can stand rooted in one spot for half an hour watching a great blue heron, just
Mhm.
mesmerized, or watching, the bunny rabbits chase each other around, whatever it might be, or even just, the trees, the flowers, the sunset. Um, all of that is just so essential to me and my mental and physical and spiritual well-being, just that time apart. um, and my husband and I just got back from 3 days in Galveston at the beach, which is about an hour and a half away from where we live. And my mom actually drove from Mississippi and met us there. But anyway, it was
Mhm.
just so wonderful. Like every time I crossed the bridge and first like smell the sea air and see the seagulls, that it's like, oh, I can breathe again,
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's hard, I feel there's like a core exhaustion that I feel right now just because of everything that's happening.
Hmm.
And I'm a pretty buoyant person. I have a lot of energy. But I do I feel like it's a very challenging time. And when I think about like the span of my lifetime, like I was at John Kennedy's funeral as a 7-year old,
Mm.
sitting on my father's shoulders. I remember when Martin Luther King was shot. My parents took me to Woodstock when I was a 13-year old.
Wow.
I saw the, you know, the Stonewall riots and the birth of the gay pride movement. I remember when Ms. Magazine first came out. Um, and, you know, so I was the you know, I was shaped by the 60s and early 70s where there was so much, it was such a time of exploding awareness and so many freedoms were being fought for. And you know, it's not that everything was, you know, there are a lot of oppression also going on, but to have that be kind of what shaped me, and then to be here when things are being so repressed and squashed, and so many freedoms that have been so hard won are being rolled back. Um, it, it's just kind of amazing for that to be my lifespan. You know, it's like
Hmm.
I was around before technology. You know,
Yes.
we didn't even have a television, and you know, and now we're going into AI, and you know, it's just interesting to have. I guess you live long enough, your lifespan is going to stretch through a lot of different realities. But to be witnessing what's going on right now, um,
Yeah, it
and to
is
feel like I don't
terrifying.
feel like I'm going to live to see the resolution of it. You know, I
Yeah.
feel I'm not gonna see the other side of whatever this thing is that we're in. And, you know, my children, I hope will, and I have grandchildren, and I think a lot about them and the world that they are growing up in, you know, that this is what's shaping them. And I think, what is that gonna mean for their lives?
Hmm. I console myself by looking at, for instance, Martin Luther King Jr. Um, and JFK and others who did have that vision, and countless others who aren't as well known, who did the work, and as you said, did not live. Maybe they saw part of it. They knew they had made a difference, but yet ultimately they were killed, or they just, their natural lifespan was not long enough for the full fruition of the seeds they had planted to happen. And yet they did the work anyway, and they knew, some of them, that they were not going to live long enough to really reap the benefits of what they had sown, but they did it anyway. And so I try to hold that in mind, that the reason we admire them now and still know their names is because they had the courage to stand up for what was right. And fate, come what may. I'm sure it was terrifying, but they knew that they couldn't stay silent and live with themselves, and that's the point that I reached as well. And it is so easy to feel hopeless and powerless now, and just terrified, frankly. As you said, the anxiety is the biggest thing, the uncertainty, and that, day after day there's something new that's even worse kind of mentality. But the other thing that helps me is to know that, that's intentional at this point. That is the goal, to have that destabilization and that sense that we have to accept it because there's nothing we can do about it. And I just, there's that part of me that's like, no, I am not willing to just lay down and die. If I get, shot for speaking my mind, to me that's more acceptable than just, passively going along with it all and pretending it's normal.
I do
But
that
that
a lot.
doesn't relieve the anxiety one bit. And just the horror and the, how did we, sink this low kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been heading here for a really long time. You know, it's not really a surprise. It's shocking, but it's not surprising, I think is what I would
Agree.
say. Um,
Yeah, the seeds were planted decades ago, with at least as far back as Reagan, and probably well before. I mean, ultimately, well before that, from at least from slavery on, and from how we treated the indigenous people, and on and on and on. But yeah, I remember in college having a bumper sticker on my car that said "Hatred is not a family value," and the rise of the moral majority, and on and on and on. There, it's always been there. It just, we happen to have this one cult like figure now who has galvanized everyone and made it socially acceptable, if not admirable, to publicly express the bigotry and the misogyny and some other things that were, for some people at least, were always under the surface, and they didn't feel they could, publicly share. Now they can.
right, right. It used to be something to be ashamed about. There was
Yes.
some when I went to the protest in Santa Cruz. I wish I could. I took pictures of a lot of signs, and there was a sign about. It was something about like making. Uh, I wish I knew the slogan, but it was about like making hate unpopular again. Like so it would go back in the hole where it came from. But yeah, I mean, and sometimes I just think on a much broader scale, of human evolution. Like, is this the end of the human experiment? Are we witnessing the end of our civilization, our species? And that kind of trips me out to think about that. Um, and I don't think we are going back to what we had or what we were. I think the only way is to move forward. And I think, one of the things that feels really critical to me is we have to think about what is the world we want to create.
Yes.
Just like reacting to this onslaught, or but it's not like, oh, I want to go back to 4 years ago or 5 years ago. I mean, there's
Right.
been rot
Yeah,
for a
I want to
very long
transform the
time.
world and make everything, as good as I can. It was never this ideal that I want to go back to. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what is the world I would like to see? I
And
feel like
what is
that.
my contribution, however small,
Mhm.
even if it is just, smiling at someone who's had a hard day, letting someone in traffic, um, saying to the grocery store cashier or your server at a restaurant, genuinely, how was your day? And giving them time to answer and just,
Mhm.
yeah, there's so many little things in addition to, the protest and calling your congress people or whatever else, it is for each person. But yeah, I mean, how we treat each other matters greatly. And
Yeah.
we can be the change we want to see, even though we may never fully see that change.
Yeah, I've noticed being much more that what you're talking about, kindness. I find myself making those choices to pay attention to other people in a way that maybe I would have been on my phone or paying attention to something else, or like wrapped in my own head, in my own thoughts,
Mhm.
and to see each interaction with someone as an opportunity, to reach out. It was really interesting on Facebook. You know how they send you reels of things from the past?
Yes.
Yeah. So
I
the
hate
last
some of those
couple,
photos that pop up. I'm like, no, I don't want to see this.
well, this week I've had like 3 days in a row. I guess when the pandemic first started, so 5 years ago, I used to go to the woods near my house where I still walk almost every day, and I would get on my iPhone and I would just talk. And then I was like for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, and I would post these little things on Facebook. So I've gotten to listen to a couple of them. So interesting to see where I was at the first weeks of the pandemic and what I was
Mhm.
thinking about and what we were doing, like the way we were. I remember Karen and I used to, when we went out to the mailbox, we would have a pair of tongs and we would take the mail out with tongs and then we would put it, in a bedroom where my son was, he was at college then, he wasn't in this room, and we would let it air out for several days before
Wow.
we would open it. I mean, just the extent to which we were just crazy. But it was interesting because that there was some real similarity in that time and this time in terms of just dealing with something unknowable,
Mhm.
uncertain, and that was so, it was like this tsunami of something so big that you can't possibly get out of the way of.
Yes.
And in some ways I see what's happening now tied very much to that time. I mean, I think that was like an accelerant of
Hmm.
something that was there all along. Um,
And they are very much tied because, of Trump's first term, and the way he reacted to the pandemic. And the whole debate about, I have the individual right to not wear a mask if I don't feel like it, and the misinformation about the vaccines, and um, on and on and on. That was part of the big church conflict at the church my husband and I served. Was, the church council thought the CDC guidelines were ridiculous and did not appreciate that we wanted to follow them. They resumed worship in June of 2020 at the height before there were vaccines or anything, in a building with, stained glass windows that could not be opened. And we made it clear that we thought they were making a big mistake, and this was, we needed to take this seriously. And yeah, they did not really appreciate
well,
that, to say the least.
yeah.
And this is Texas, and our state government has for years been, basically what our federal government is becoming now.
So how do you, with that being said, how do you cope with living there? with the way you believe and what you feel and what you care about, to be
Well,
surrounded.
again, there are pockets that are very
Hmm.
different. For instance, my husband and I thought we were totally done with church based on the previous bad experience, and some that we interviewed with before we realized no, none of these churches can we in good conscience go along with, or pretend to believe things we don't, or even just stay silent about the racism or anti LGBTQ, whatever. But with that said, we attend a congregation now that even though the Christian theology part isn't necessarily what we believe, the social justice work is.
Mm.
And the congregation's welcome statement says, we welcome people of all sexual orientations, gender identities, and a whole slew of other things. But it's just a very different environment. And there are other churches like that here. And there are, of course, democratic groups and coalitions of various kinds, both locally and nationally. There's a wonderful group, Faithful America. There's another one, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, that are speaking out with the counter message of Jesus love and inclusion of everyone. And, we are supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves and treat immigrants the same way we treat natives and help people when they're poor. All of this is straight out of the Bible and every other, great spiritual tradition and spiritual leader, basic love your neighbor as yourself stuff. Um, but so yeah, even though the prevailing environment is horrific politically speaking, from my point of view, and social justice speaking, uh, we just find our own pockets of like-minded people, basically, and spend time with them to lift each other up and renew our spirits. And also there's something to be said for me anyway of that feeling of, I can be a voice in the wilderness who is pointing out how evil this is and documenting it, not just giving opinions but countering all the misinformation with, here are the facts, here's the official GOP website platform where they say this explicitly, here's the video of this speech or the official transcript, whatever. And that does not change anyone's mind, of course, but unless maybe some undecided, people in the middle. But it makes me feel like I'm doing my part. Whereas I think if I lived in a state that was, totally progressive and that I, agreed with the prevailing sentiments, that would be wonderful in one sense. But in another sense, I would feel like, okay, what difference can I make here? It's already, reflecting my values versus there need to be more people in Texas publicly countering these messages of hate and challenging this legislation and on and on and on.
Uh, Good for you. That's what I have to say. I mean, I think, I live in California in a pretty progressive town, although not 100%, and there's always tons of local issues, that
Hmm.
need support one way or another. So
Yes,
there's always work to be done, whether you're living in a red place or a blue place or a purple place, for sure.
absolutely. Yep. And the other point, to be perfectly honest, is that I hate cold weather. So snow and ice. I used to live in Pennsylvania. Was there when there was a blizzard, scraping the windshield every day of the ice,
Yeah.
and just, yeah, I'm done with that. My husband and I actually lived in Hawaii for quite a while. That was another way we decided we didn't care what other people thought we should do. 5 years into our careers, we went to Maui for our 10th anniversary. Loved it so much we came back, put our house on the market,
Well,
resigned our from our jobs, one way ticket to Maui, drove cross country to ship the car there on a barge, the whole nine. And ultimately, yeah, it wasn't financially sustainable. After 10 years on Maui, we left, and we resumed our careers as pastors, but no regrets at all. It was a
mhm,
glorious time
mhm.
on Maui. Uh,
Yeah. I know a lot of people who've moved to Hawaii, and it's either been like a fantastic experience or a hellhole.
mhm.
Like, it seems to be intense,
Yeah, a lot of
either
people
way.
go there and don't last beyond like 1 year.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it hard to find a job before you get there, which neither one of us had, because the locals are understandably skeptical. They don't think you'll stick around.
Mhm.
Um, But yeah, it was a wonderful place to live. And I'm just glad that we made that choice, even though people thought we were crazy. We still had all the student loan debt from grad school, and here we are giving up our careers to go live on this tropical island. But it was absolutely fantastic. Well, I know we're getting beyond the hour here, so probably need to wrap up soon. But I did want to close with the question of if you could go back and tell your younger self
Mm.
one thing, would you? And if so, what would it be?
It would be, you're going to be okay. I mean, it would just be that simple because as a young person, I was so convinced I was not okay, that I was really irreparably broken. So that's what it'd be. You're going to be okay. You'll make it. And you're going to have love in your life. You're going to have you're going to have um, all the things you dream about that you want that you don't think you're going to have. You can have them.
Wonderful. And that is so similar to mine, even though I didn't have, the horrific childhood abuse that you endured. Mine was, you are lovable and loved, and your worth does not depend on your achievements or your
Mm,
productivity.
mm. Yes, I love that message too. I'll piggyback on your message as well.
Wonderful. Well, I feel like we could continue this conversation for hours, but I try to keep these to roughly an hour because obviously people have other things to do. But for those of you who joined late or who couldn't watch it this time, the full replay will be shared by me later on my page, and I imagine by Laura as well on her Substack. It'll
Definitely.
also be available on YouTube and of course on Substack in the app. So yeah, thank you all who did join live, and if you're watching this later as a replay, thank you for your interest in what Laura and I had to share in our message, and hope that you will find hope from us and the courage to embrace your true self and express that true self no matter what other people think of your choices or your life. Any parting words, Laura?
Thanks for inviting me. Glad I am no longer a Substack Live virgin. I just the whole technology of this is not what I expected, and it
I'm
was
still
great
learning
to
it too.
great to spend the time with you. That's what I want to say.
Likewise, thank
Yeah,
you so much for being one of my guests, and I love your work and wish you well.
thank you. You too.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.